The sound of my son's wheelchair hitting the kitchen doorway was something I had heard 1,000 times. That morning, I heard something I had never heard before. Footsteps, slow, uneven, heavy. I turned around so quickly that the coffee cup slipped from my hand and shattered across the floor. My son was standing there. After 6 years of paralysis, he was gripping the doorway with both hands, his face pale, his knees trembling so badly I thought he was going to collapse. But he didn't. He looked straight at me and whispered, "Mom, we need to leave, right now." I couldn't move. "Daniel." He nodded. Then he looked toward the hallway, as if he was afraid someone might be listening. "Where's Rachel?" My throat tightened. "She left yesterday." His face changed. "She told you she was going on a business trip." I nodded slowly. Daniel closed his eyes. "Then we don't have much time." For 6 years, I had watched my son lose pieces of himself. Before the accident, Daniel had been the kind of man who never sat still. He worked with his hands, played weekend basketball with friends, and complained whenever his father told him he was working too much. Then, one rainy evening, everything changed. A truck crossed the center line. Daniel survived, but his spine was badly damaged. The doctors told us he might never walk again. He was 32. His wife Rachel stayed beside him at first. She slept in hospital chairs. She learned how to operate his wheelchair. She helped him with meals, medication, bathing, and physical therapy. At least, that's what I believed. For the first 2 years, I admired her. I even defended her when relatives quietly suggested that caring for a disabled husband was too much for a young woman. "Rachel loves him," I would say. "She isn't going anywhere," and she didn't. Not physically. But somewhere along the way, something inside her changed. Daniel became quieter. Rachel became impatient. She stopped talking to him unless she needed something. Then she started traveling for work. At first it was one trip every few months, then once a month, then sometimes every other week. Whenever I asked where she was going, she gave me the same answer: business. Daniel never complained. That was what bothered me most. He used to complain about everything. Now he apologized for needing help. He apologized when he dropped a fork. He apologized when physical therapy hurt. He apologized when Rachel looked tired. And I began to hate myself for noticing how carefully he watched her face whenever she entered the room, as if he was constantly trying to determine whether she was disappointed in him. The day before Daniel stood in my kitchen, Rachel had packed a small suitcase. She kissed his forehead. "I'll only be gone for 3 days." Daniel smiled. "Drive safely." She looked at me. "Please make sure he takes his evening medication." "I always do." She gave a faint smile. "Good." Then she left. I watched her car disappear down the street. Something about that departure stayed with me. Maybe it was the way she didn't look back, or maybe it was the strange relief on her face. That night, Daniel asked me something I had never heard him ask before. "Mom, do you trust Rachel?" I looked at him. "What kind of question is that?" He stared at the floor. "Just answer." I hesitated. "I want to." He nodded. That was all he said. The next morning, I found him standing in my kitchen. "How are you standing?" I whispered. "Physical therapy." "Since when?" "Almost 8 months. I felt my knees weaken." "8 months?" He nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know who I could trust." That sentence frightened me more than his walking. Daniel explained that after years of therapy, he had started feeling small movements in his legs. At first he could barely move one toe, then his ankle. Then, with support, he could stand. Rachel knew. Or at least, she knew something. Daniel had told her months earlier that his doctors were optimistic about his recovery. Her reaction had surprised him. She hadn't smiled. She had gone completely silent. Then she said, "You shouldn't get your hopes up." But Daniel kept working, and secretly, he began learning to walk again. He told me he wanted his first steps to be a surprise. He wanted to walk into the house one morning and make me cry. I laughed through my tears. "You succeeded." He almost smiled. Then his expression became serious. "Mom, that's not why I kept it secret." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I found something." He showed me a series of messages. At first they looked harmless. Travel plans, hotel reservations, work meetings. But then I noticed another name, a man named Victor. Daniel had discovered that Rachel had been communicating with Victor for nearly 2 years. They weren't discussing business, they were discussing Daniel. I read one message twice because I didn't understand it. Rachel had written, "He can't know yet." Victor replied, "How much longer?" Rachel said, "Until the house is transferred." My hands became cold. Our house, the house where Daniel and Rachel lived, the house Daniel had inherited from his father. The house that was worth far more than either of them admitted. Daniel had also found bank statements showing money leaving their joint account. Small amounts at first, then larger transfers, thousands of dollars, payments to an account Daniel didn't recognize. But there was something worse. Rachel wasn't simply planning to leave Daniel. She had been preparing to control his finances. Daniel had discovered documents showing that she had been trying to convince him to sign paperwork giving her authority over certain assets. "If I had signed those papers," he said quietly, "she would have had access to almost everything." I stared at him. "Why didn't you confront her?" "Because I wanted to know why." That answer stayed with me. We spent the next few hours going through everything Daniel had collected. There were photographs, emails, bank records, and finally, a recording. Daniel had placed a small recorder near his desk weeks earlier because he suspected Rachel was discussing him with someone. I didn't want to hear it, but I did. Rachel's voice came through clearly. "He's getting better." Victor asked, "How much better?" "Enough that it could become a problem." My stomach turned. Victor said, "Then you need to move faster." Rachel replied, "I'm trying." Then came the sentence that broke something inside me. I built my life around a man who couldn't give me anything back. "I'm not going to spend the rest of it trapped." Daniel stopped the recording. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I looked at my son. He wasn't crying. That somehow made it worse. "I loved her," he said. "I know, I still do." I reached across the table. He pulled away. "Not from me. From the memory." Then he told me something else. He hadn't discovered Rachel's secret by accident. His physical therapist had warned him that his recovery might change his marriage. People sometimes behaved differently when a person they had learned to see as dependent began becoming independent again. Daniel hadn't believed it until he started walking. That was when Rachel began acting differently, more nervous, more controlling, more desperate to get him to sign documents, and now she had left for a supposed business trip. Daniel believed she was planning to return with a final set of papers, but he had one more reason for believing she was lying. He had tracked the reservation confirmation from one of her emails. She hadn't gone to a business conference. She had booked a hotel in another city with Victor. We sat in silence. Then Daniel stood again, this time without holding the doorway. He took 3 steps toward me. His legs shook. He almost fell. I caught him. He laughed quietly. "I'm going to get better." I hugged him. "You already are." But we couldn't stay in the house and wait. Daniel wanted to confront Rachel. I wanted him to walk away. Instead, we decided to do something neither of us had expected. We went to the house. Not to confront her. To retrieve his father's documents and the original property records. When we arrived, Rachel's suitcase was gone, but someone had been inside. A drawer had been left open. Papers were scattered across the floor, and on the kitchen table was an envelope addressed to Daniel. Inside was a letter. Rachel had written that she was leaving because she couldn't continue living as his caregiver. She apologized. She said she deserved a life of her own. For the first time, I felt sorry for her, not because I approved of what she had done, but because I realized she had been unhappy for a long time. Daniel read the letter quietly. Then he noticed something. The date. Rachel had written the letter 3 months earlier, 3 months before she claimed she had decided to leave. That meant the business trips, the secret account, the meetings with Victor. All of it had been planned long before Daniel knew. Then we heard a car outside. Rachel walked through the door. She froze when she saw Daniel standing. Her face went completely white. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then she whispered, "You're walking." Daniel nodded. "Yes." She looked at me, then back at him. "How long?" 8 months. She sat down. I had expected anger. Instead, she looked exhausted. "I didn't know," she whispered. Daniel stared at her. "You knew I was doing therapy. I knew you were trying." "No. You knew I was walking." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I saw you once." Daniel's face tightened. "When?" 3 months ago. The room went silent. She admitted she had seen him standing during a therapy session. She had watched from the hallway, and instead of being happy, she had panicked. Because by then she had already built a new life in her head. Victor wasn't simply a business partner. He was someone she had been emotionally involved with. She had convinced herself that Daniel's condition gave her permission to leave. But when she realized he was recovering, she became afraid that he would discover everything before she was ready. "I was scared," she said. Daniel shook his head. "You weren't scared of losing me." She couldn't answer. "You were scared of losing what you could take from me." Rachel began crying. She said she regretted the financial plans. She said she had never intended to hurt him, but Daniel interrupted her. "You don't get to call it an accident." She looked at him. "You made choices. That was the moment I realized my son had changed. Not because he could walk, because he no longer believed he had to beg someone to stay." Rachel eventually left the house. Victor disappeared from her life soon afterward, once the financial plans collapsed. Daniel didn't try to save the marriage, neither did I. Some relationships can survive illness. Some can survive money problems. Some can survive betrayal. But sometimes the hardest thing to accept is that the person you were fighting to keep had already left long before they packed a suitcase. Months later, Daniel took his first walk outside without assistance. I stood beside him on the sidewalk. He moved slowly, one step, then another, then another. He stopped beneath the old maple tree where his father had taught him to ride a bicycle as a child. "I thought walking again would fix everything," he said. I smiled. "It doesn't?" "No." He looked toward the street. "But it gave me something better." "What?" "The chance to choose what happens next." I knew what he meant. For 6 years we had measured his life by what he couldn't do. Now he was measuring it by what he could. He sold the house eventually, not because Rachel forced him to, because he didn't want to spend the rest of his life surrounded by memories that made him feel small. He bought a modest place closer to the rehabilitation center. He started working again, slowly. He made new friends. He even laughed more. Real laughter. The kind I hadn't heard since before the accident. And sometimes when I think about that morning in my kitchen, I remember the sound of those footsteps. Not because they were proof that my son could walk. They were proof that he had finally stopped waiting for someone else to decide what his life was worth. Rachel left for a business trip believing she was escaping a man who could no longer give her the life she wanted. She didn't know that while she was preparing to leave him, he was quietly preparing to stand. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. She thought his recovery would make him harder to leave. Instead, it made him strong enough to let her go.